Imagine you're living in Smithfield, North Carolina, in the spring of 1779. And it's not a difficult thing to imagine because there's not very much to imagine. Smithfield at this point is 2 years old. It was incorporated in 1777. Before that, it was called Johnston County Courthouse, which tells you everything about what it was. It was just a courthouse with a ferry crossing the Neuse River and the farms and houses that had gathered around them. The town has a few streets, and that's about it: a courthouse, some taverns, a handful of merchants, a population that, if you're being generous, might have numbers in the dozens of permanent residents, and that's being generous. It's a Thursday morning in early May. You have things to do. You have a farm to tend at what is now downtown Smithfield, or a ferry to run, or goods to sell. The war's been going on for 4 years now, the revolution, and it is not going particularly well. And the specific way that it is not going well has started to feel personal in the way that things feel personal when the fighting is no longer somewhere abstract, like Boston or Trenton, but somewhere like Georgia, which is not very far away at all. And then coming down Green's path from the north and east, you see them: horses, wagons. Men in travel-worn coats, more horses, more wagons, a great deal of paper, and behind them more men and more horses. And it does not stop, y'all. Nobody comes to Smithfield, and now you have a horde. That horde is the new government of the state of North Carolina, and it's just arrived. All of it. And it needs a place to sleep. Welcome to Joko Yo. The North Carolina General Assembly did not come to Smithfield because Smithfield was impressive. It came to Smithfield because the places it would rather have been were either occupied, threatened, or inconveniently close to a British army. This was the nature of governing a state in a war you were, at that particular moment, losing. The legislature had been meeting wherever it could find safety. New Bern, the colonial capital, had been exposed and vulnerable since the royal governor fled in 1775. Halifax, up near the Virginia border, was safer but exposed to British coastal raids. Hillsborough was fine until it wasn't. The assembly moved constantly, chased by the same military reality that was chasing everybody else. The British Southern strategy was working. Savannah had fallen in December of 1778. Georgia was effectively back under British control by the spring of 1779. Charleston, South Carolina, the largest city in the American South, was under increasing pressure. And if Charleston fell, North Carolina would undoubtedly be next. Smithfield, on the other hand, was inland. It sat on the Neuse River in the middle of Johnston County, well back from the coast, accessible by Green's Path, but not obviously on the road to anywhere the British Army was currently pointing. It had a courthouse, which was the minimum infrastructure a legislature required, and it was, for the moment, quiet. Now, that was the full case for Smithfield as the seat of government of the state of North Carolina in May of 1779. It was inland and it was quiet, and in the spring of 1779, that was enough for Smithfield to be the temporary capital. The North Carolina Constitution of 1776 created a legislature with one senator and 2 House members from each county. By 1779, there were roughly 50 counties, giving the Assembly an authorized membership of around 150 men, though not all of them showed up and not all at once. The road from Edenton was long. The road from the western counties was even longer. Men filtered in across the first week of May, presenting their credentials and taking their seats as they arrived. But even at half capacity, 75,000 legislators present a significant logistical event for a town of a few dozen permanent residents. They did not travel alone. Horses, servants, aides, trunks of state records, a full apparatus of a government that had been conducting a war for 3 years. And tucked inside all of it, the full weight of what they had to decide. Because the agenda for the Smithfield session was not routine. This legislature needed to re-elect a governor. It needed to raise more troops, again, for a war that kept consuming men faster than the state could replace them. It needed to deal with the money, which was a polite way of saying that it needed to figure out what to do about the fact that North Carolina's paper currency was collapsing in value so fast that a soldier's monthly pay could barely buy a week's worth of food. It had needed to pass a law sending aid to South Carolina and Georgia, whose armies were the only things standing between the British Southern strategy and the North Carolina border. And all this had to happen in a 2-year-old town with one courthouse and one ferry. The courthouse itself could seat perhaps 40 to 50 men in reasonable comfort. The Senate and the House of Commons did not meet jointly. They met separately, debated separately, reconciled their differences in conference committees, and then voted. This means the courthouse was a near constant use from morning to late evening, with whatever chamber was not in formal session crowding into the taverns and open spaces of the town to conduct the informal business that is, in any legislature, the real business: the arguments, the deals, the vote counting, the letter writing, the exhausted consultations between men who had ridden 3 days to get here and would ride 3 days to get home. Smithfield's taverns, and there are not many of them, were full. Every spare room in every single house in the town was full. The overflow, and there was definitely overflow, was sleeping in outbuildings, in tents along the river, wherever a man and a horse could find flat ground and a roof. The horses were everywhere, which meant the mud was everywhere, which meant the smell was everywhere. A legislative session in a small town in May is not a delicate thing, especially here. The permanent residents of Smithfield were, depending on their temperament and their proximity to the courthouse, either making very good money selling food and lodging and horses' feed, or they were trying to go about their ordinary lives in a town that had temporarily tripled in population and showed no signs of quieting down until the legislature said it was done. Richard Caswell was there, the governor of North Carolina, the man who had commanded part of Tryon's militia at the Battle of Alamance 8 years earlier, and then turned around and led a revolution. Well, he was in Smithfield for this session. The legislature reelected him governor on May 3rd, the first day of the session, which tells you how badly they needed continuity in a situation that had very little of it. Samuel Johnston was almost there as well. His fingerprints are on the session's legislation. Allen Jones, the president of the Senate, Thomas Benberry, Speaker of the House, the men who were, at that exact moment, the functioning government of a state trying hard not to go back under British rule. All of them, for 13 days in May of 1779, were in Smithfield. Now, the legislation that came out of the Smithfield session was not glamorous. It was the legislation of a government operating under emergency conditions, trying to keep a revolution alive with the tools that they had available. They passed an act raising more regular troops for the defense of North Carolina and its neighbors, the same act they had passed in a slightly different form at almost every session for the last 3 years because the war kept eating soldiers. They passed an act sending military aid to South Carolina and Georgia, whose situation they understood was desperate. They passed an act dealing with the currency crisis, authorizing a new emission of paper money and specifying in bureaucratic detail that speaks to how bad things had gotten exactly how the new bills were to be printed, impressed, and secured against counterfeiting, and what penalties would apply to anyone who faked them. Now, the Currency Act carries a detail worth pausing on. The bills that authorized were inscribed, agreeable to an act of assembly passed at Smithfield on the 15th day of May, 1779. The money of North Carolina said Smithfield on it. The money of North Carolina said Smithfield on it. Every bill that circulated in the state carried the name of this 2-year-old town on the Neuse River as the place where the government had been when it printed the money. Man, that's a form of immortality that nobody in Smithfield had ever asked for. They also, while here, established 2 counties, or abolished 2 counties, Butte and Tryon, renaming them Warren and Lincoln. Tryon County had been named for the royal governor who had crushed the regulators at Alamance in 1771, and the legislature, meeting in a town that sits on the road that Tryon's army had marched along to get to that battle, decided that naming a county after him was no longer appropriate. They replaced his name with Lincoln, Benjamin Lincoln, not Abraham. The Continental Army general currently trying to hold Charleston, South Carolina against a British force that would take the city the following year. They were, in other words, doing the work. Unglamorous, administrative, fiscally tortured work in a small courthouse that's barely bigger than a log cabin in a small town under the shadow of a war that was going badly. They did it for 13 days, and on May 15, 1779, they left. They adjourned. Now, on the morning of May 16, 1779, the governor of North Carolina left Smithfield the same way it arrived, down Green's Path in pieces, men peeling off towards their home counties as the road divided and divided again. The courthouse was empty again. The taverns were quieter than they had been in 2 weeks. The mud where the horses had stood was now drying in the May sun. The permanent residents of Smithfield, the ferry operator, the tavern keeper, the handful of merchants who had spent 13 days feeding and housing and supplying the apparatus of a state government, they went back to their lives. They had been, for less than a fortnight, the capital of North Carolina. Nobody had asked them if they wanted to be. The government simply needed a place, and they had been the place. And that's sort of how history tends to work, especially for small towns in the path of large events. No one designates big historic events and places. They just sort of happen there. The war went on for 2 more years after the Smithfield Cession. Charleston fell to the British, back under British rule in May of 1780, the largest American defeat of the entire Revolution. 5,000 soldiers surrendered at once. Cornwallis invaded North Carolina. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought in March 1781, 40 miles from where the legislators had slept in Smithfield. The legislature kept moving. Hillsborough, Wake Courthouse, Halifax, staying ahead of the British Army the way it had always, luckily, miraculously, stayed ahead of it. And then in October of 1781, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, and a surprise move to everybody involved, and the war that had been going so badly for so long was suddenly and completely improbably over. Even Washington himself said he was caught by surprise. The currency that said Smithfield on it was eventually retired, replaced by harder money as the economy stabilized. Butte County stayed Warren County, Tryon County stayed Lincoln County. Richard Caswell served out his term, left office, and came back for his second stint as governor years later. Samuel Johnston became a U.S. Senator. Smithfield kept growing, slowly at first, then faster. Tobacco, cotton, and the railroad came through in 95, found its way down the old Greens Path corridor. It became eventually the kind of town that has a history museum and a doughboy statue on the courthouse lawn and a podcast that tells stories about things that most people have forgotten. You're welcome. Including the 13 days in May of 1779 when the horses were everywhere and the mud was deep and the government of a state that was trying not to be reconquered was sleeping in your barn. Hey y'all, that's Joe Coyo today. Be good.